The wind was a blade against the world, shearing the last of the autumn light from the sky and leaving only the bruised purple of an early dusk. Silas felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that spoke of snow and solitude. He drove the axe into another round of pine, the sharp crack a lonely sound in the vast emptiness of the high plains. His cabin, a squat silhouette of rough-hewn logs, was a small fist clenched against the coming storm. It was all he had, all he wanted. He worked until the burn in his shoulders overshadowed the one in his soul, stacking the wood with a methodical precision that kept thought at bay. Inside, the fire would need to be fed through the night. The horses were secure in the lean-to, their breath misting in the frigid air. He had done this for 5 winters. He knew the rhythms of survival. It was the silence he was still learning. A shadow of movement caught his eye at the edge of the cottonwoods that bordered his property. It was nothing, a deer, a trick of the fading light. But a tension coiled in his gut, a primal instinct he'd thought long buried. He paused, axe handle resting in his scarred hands, and watched. The wind howled, whipping stray snowflakes past his face. Then he saw it again. A horse, riderless, stumbling through the deepening drifts, its head low with exhaustion. It went down, a dark shape collapsing into the white. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy oilskin coat from a peg by the door and the lantern he'd just filled, his movements economical and swift. The world beyond his clearing was already a churning chaos of snow and wind. He followed the horse's tracks, the lantern light a small, defiant gold against the maelstrom. He found the animal half-buried, its sides heaving in shallow, frosted gasps. And huddled against its failing warmth were 2 smaller shapes, almost lost to the snow, a woman and a child. He knelt, the lantern casting their faces in a flickering, ghostly light. The woman's eyes were closed, her face a pale mask of chapped skin and blue-tinged lips. A thread of dark hair was frozen to her cheek. The child, a boy no older than 5, was tucked into the curve of her body, his small face lax and unervingly still. Silas felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He pressed his fingers against the boy's neck, a pulse faint and thready, but there. Then the woman's, the same. He worked quickly, untangling them from the stiff, frozen blankets. The woman was dead weight, but he lifted her into his arms, the thinness of her frame a shock. He carried her back to the cabin, the wind tearing at them, trying to reclaim them. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, the firelight dancing over her exhausted features. Then he went back out into the screaming dark for the boy. When they were both inside, the door bolted against the storm, the silence of the cabin felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the precarious weight of 2 lives hanging by a thread. He worked without emotion, a surgeon of survival. He stripped the wet, frozen clothes from the boy first, his small body a canvas of bruises. He wrapped him in dry wool blankets and set a pot of broth to warm on the hearth. He then turned to the woman. Her clothes were threadbare, a summer dress offering no defense against the teeth of winter. As he peeled the sodden fabric from her skin, he saw what the cold had hidden. Her body was a roadmap of cruelty. Old scars, yellowing bruises, and fresh welts that spoke of a recent and brutal violence. The firelight caught on something dark just below her collarbone, a mark seared into her skin, a brand. He had seen such marks on cattle. His breath caught in his throat. It was then that her eyelids fluttered. Her gaze was unfocused, clouded with pain and delirium. She tried to pull the blanket back over herself, a gesture of pure, instinctual fear. Her lips parted, a dry, cracked sound escaping. "Just kill me fast," she breathed, the words a wisp of sound almost lost to the crackle of the flames. Please, he saw no fight in her eyes, only a profound and terrible surrender, an acceptance of an end she had been running toward or from. The cowboy drew the blanket he held in his hand up to her chin, his large, calloused fingers gentle. And then he stumbled back in silence. He didn't stumble from horror at her words or her wounds. He stumbled from the violent, unwelcome ghost of a memory. Another woman's face, flickering in firelight. Another life he had failed to save. The carefully constructed walls of his solitude, built brick by silent brick over 5 years, fractured in an instant. He stood there for a long moment, a statue in the warm light of his home, the storm raging outside and a far more terrible one raging within. He turned away, his jaw tight, and ladled the warm broth into a bowl. He did not kill her. He kept her alive. The blizzard raged for 3 days, entombing them in a world of white. The cabin became a pocket of strained silence, the air thick with things unsaid. Silas moved with a quiet purpose, tending the fire, checking on his stock, and leaving bowls of stew or broth on a small crate near where the woman and boy lay. He did not speak. He did not ask her name. He called them only the woman and the boy in his own mind, a deliberate distance he tried to maintain. The woman, whose name was Alara, woke in fragments. She would surface into a disorienting warmth, the scent of wood smoke and stew filling her senses, before being pulled back under by the tide of exhaustion and fever. Each time she woke, her first instinct was a jolt of pure terror. Her eyes would fly open, searching the room for a threat. But all she ever saw was the broad back of the silent man as he stoked the fire or stood looking out the small, frosted window. He never approached her unless necessary, to offer water or check the boy. Her son, Leo. Her anchor. She would reach out a trembling hand to touch his cheek, assuring herself he was still there, still breathing. He slept deeply, a sleep that seemed to be healing something more than just his body. When he was finally awake, his eyes were huge and dark in his small face, and they followed the man with a silent, unnerving intensity. He did not speak. He had not spoken a word since they had fled, since he had seen his mother dragged from their wagon by the hair. Silas was acutely aware of their eyes on him. The woman's were filled with a wary, animal caution, the boy's with a deep, bottomless trauma. He felt like a jailer and a savior all at once. He found himself moving more slowly, more deliberately, so as not to startle them. He kept his hands visible. He avoided sudden movements. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Alara was weak but lucid. She sat up, pulling the thick wool blanket tightly around her shoulders, a shield against the world. She watched Silas carve a piece of scrap wood by the fire. His hands, though scarred and rough, were surprisingly deft. Shavings fell to the floor as a shape began to emerge from the block. A horse. For Leo. The boy sat huddled by his mother, his gaze fixed on the man's knife. He didn't flinch from the blade. He seemed mesmerized by the creation, by the act of something being made instead of broken. When Silas was done, he sanded the small wooden horse with a piece of leather until it was smooth. He didn't look at the boy, didn't try to force the interaction. He simply set the toy on the floor midway between them and went back to his own side of the hearth. For a full hour, the horse stood in no man's land. Leo stared at it, his small face a mask of conflict. Alara placed a gentle hand on his back but said nothing. Finally, his curiosity won out. He crawled forward, a slow, hesitant motion, snatched the horse, and scrambled back to the safety of his mother's arms, clutching the small wooden creature to his chest as if it were a holy relic. Silas saw the movement from the corner of his eye. He did not turn. He did not smile. But a knot in his chest he hadn't known was there eased just a fraction. It was the first bridge built across the chasm of silence. A few days later, while Silas was outside clearing a path to the barn, Alara found the strength to stand. Her body ached, a symphony of pain, but the helplessness was worse. She saw his rifle mounted over the fireplace. Her first thought was to take it. But where would she go? The snow was still waist-deep. They would die out there. Her gaze fell on his worn shirt, draped over a chair, a tear in the sleeve. She found a small sewing kit in a wooden box on a shelf. Her hands trembled as she threaded the needle, but the simple, familiar task was grounding. She sat by the fire, Leo at her feet playing with the wooden horse, and she mended the man's shirt. Her stitches were small and neat, an act of care, an offering. When Silas returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway. He saw his mended shirt. He saw her, sitting in his chair by his fire, a needle in her hand. He saw the boy safe. For a fleeting second, the cabin looked like a home. He looked at her, and she met his gaze, just for a moment, before dropping her eyes back to her work. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He understood the gesture. It was a payment, a plea, a quiet declaration that she was more than a victim. She was a survivor. One afternoon, the storm long past, Silas pulled on his coat and walked up the small hill behind the cabin. Alara watched from the window. She saw him stop before two small mounds of stone, barely visible above the snow. He brushed the snow from them with a gloved hand. His shoulders slumped. He stood there for a long time, a solitary figure against the vast white landscape, his grief a palpable thing even from a distance. She didn't know who was buried there, but she knew the shape of his loss. It mirrored her own. She looked down at Leo, who had come to stand beside her, his small hand slipping into hers. In the shared language of sorrow, they were beginning to understand one another. The world thawed. The snow receded, revealing the bruised and sodden earth beneath. The meltwater dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a sound like a slow, unsteady clock counting down their time. With the clearing of the pass, the fragile peace of their sanctuary was broken. The threat of the outside world returned. Silas found the tracks one morning near the river. A single-shod horse, its rider having stopped to survey the cabin from a distance before turning back. He didn't tell her, but she knew. She saw it in the new tension in his shoulders, in the way he cleaned his rifle that evening, the metallic clicks of the action sharp and deliberate in the quiet room. Her fear, which had receded to a dull ache, returned with the force of a physical blow. She felt the cold dread in her stomach, the familiar urge to run. But there was nowhere left to run. That night, as Silas banked the fire, she finally spoke to him, her voice low and raspy from disuse. "His name is Cain," she said. Silas stopped, his back to her. He did not turn. "He owns the largest ranch in the valley 2 days west of here. He bought me from my father for the price of 3 good horses." The words came out haltingly, each one a stone she had to force from her throat. "Leo's father, he was a good man, a hired hand. Cain killed him when he found out about us. He said we belonged to him. The boy, too." She looked at her son, asleep on the pallet, clutching his wooden horse. "He will not stop. He will never stop." Silas finally turned to face her. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making his eyes impossible to read. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, like stones grinding together. Let him come. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. Promise. He arrived 3 days later, just after dawn. The air was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Cain rode a magnificent black stallion, and he had 2 men with him, their faces hard and empty. He did not approach the cabin with aggression, but with the lazy confidence of a man retrieving property. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the door, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Silas was already outside, leaning against the porch rail, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. His rifle was just inside the door, within arm's reach. "Morning," Cain called out, his voice smooth and pleasant. It was the kind of voice that could mask unimaginable cruelty. "I believe you have something of mine." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the cup down carefully on the rail. "I have nothing that's yours." Cain's smile tightened. "The woman, the boy, they carry my brand. I'm a patient man, but my patience has its limits. Send them out and we'll be on our way. No trouble for you." Silas straightened up, his full height seeming to cast a long shadow even in the morning sun. He looked past Cain to the mountains on the horizon, then back at the man. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the clearing with absolute finality. "They're not yours." The air crackled with tension. Cain's friendly facade dropped away, revealing the ugly sneer beneath. He nodded to his men. "Get them." The world exploded into motion. Silas was inside and back out with the rifle before the first man had dismounted. The first shot cracked through the morning stillness, and one of Cain's men tumbled from his saddle. The other drew his pistol, diving for cover behind a water trough. Cain spurred his horse, charging not at Silas, but at the side of the cabin, intending to smash through the window. Inside, Elara had shoved Leo under the heavy wooden table. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the paralyzing fear was gone, replaced by a white-hot, protective rage. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight solid and real in her hands. She would not be a victim, not again. The window shattered inwards, glass and wood exploding into the room. A man's face, bearded and snarling, appeared in the opening. He started to climb through, his pistol raised. Elara didn't scream. She lunged, swinging the poker with all the force of her desperation. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He collapsed back out of the window, silent. Outside, Silas exchanged fire with the second man, using the porch posts as cover. He moved with a grim efficiency, the motions of aiming and firing as natural to him as breathing. A bullet splintered the wood next to his head. He fired back, and the man behind the trough cried out and fell still. That left Cain. He had circled the cabin and now came at Silas from the side, dismounted, a large knife glittering in his hand. He was big, powerful, and fueled by a possessive fury. "She's mine!" he roared, lunging. Silas met his charge, using the rifle as a club. The two men grappled, a desperate, brutal fight of fists and steel. Cain was stronger, but Silas was faster, driven by a purpose deeper than greed. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the mud and melted snow. Cain's knife sliced through Silas's sleeve, drawing a deep gash in his forearm. Pain flared, hot and sharp. Silas grunted, slamming his forehead into Cain's face. The man's head snapped back, his grip on the knife loosening for just a second. It was all Silas needed. He twisted, wrenching the knife from Cain's hand and driving his own fist into the man's throat. Cain gargled, his eyes wide with shock, and Silas scrambled back, grabbing the heavy rifle. Cain staggered to his feet, clutching his throat, his face turning a dark purple. He looked at Silas not with hatred, but with disbelief. He couldn't comprehend being denied. Silas raised the rifle. The final shot echoed off the mountains, and then there was only silence. The aftermath was quiet. The sun climbed higher, indifferent. Elara emerged from the cabin, her face pale but her eyes fierce and steady. She saw Silas, leaning against the porch, his arm bleeding freely onto the dirt. She went to him, her movements no longer hesitant. She tore a strip from her petticoat and, without a word, began to bind his wound. Their roles were now reversed. He had saved her body. She was now saving his. They did not speak of the violence. They buried the bodies on the far side of the property, far from the two small graves on the hill. The work was hard and somber, a final act of closing a terrible chapter. That evening, they sat by the fire, the silence between them different now. It was not a silence of fear or uncertainty, but of shared experience, a silence of peace. Leo, who had been hidden away during the fight, crawled out from under the table and went not to his mother, but to Silas. He stood before the wounded man and held up the small wooden horse. Silas looked down at the boy, his stern features softened by exhaustion. He reached out with his good hand and gently ruffled Leo's hair. Days turned into a week. Spring arrived in earnest. The last of the snow melted away, revealing small, determined green shoots pushing through the earth. Life was returning. Silas was mending a fence at the edge of the pasture, his arm still bandaged. The movements were slow, but steady. He was rebuilding. Elara came out of the cabin, carrying a dipper of cool water. Leo walked beside her, his small hand holding tightly to hers. She passed the dipper to Silas, their fingers brushing. A simple touch, but it carried the weight of 1,000 words. He drank deeply, then handed it back, his eyes meeting hers. In her gaze he saw not gratitude, but partnership. She was not a guest here, not a refugee. She was home. As he turned back to the fence, a small hand tugged on his trousers. He looked down. Leo was staring up at him, his dark eyes clear and bright for the first time. He pointed a small finger at the newly mended section of fence, then at Silas, then at his mother, and then at himself. He opened his mouth, and a sound came out, not a word, but a beginning. It was enough. Silas reached down and swung the boy up to sit on the top rail of the fence. He stood there for a long moment, flanked by the woman and the child, the warm sun on their faces. The wind whispered through the pines, no longer a blade, but a promise. The cowboy, the mother, and the boy. A family forged in a blizzard, tested by violence, and now, finally, bound by the quiet, unshakable strength of a mended fence under a spring sky.